August 17, 2000, the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles. Tipper Gore introduces her husband to the country, and when he walks on stage, he takes her in his arms and kisses her for 3 full seconds in front of a live television audience of millions. The press called it the kiss. It was analyzed for weeks. And it worked because it was making an argument without saying a word. The argument was this: the administration Al Gore had served in for 8 years had been consumed by a sex scandal that led to a presidential impeachment. And here, on that stage, was the alternative. 40 years of visible devotion. The marriage America was told was the real thing. 10 years later, on June 1st, 2010, an email went out to a small circle of friends and associates. According to the Associated Press, which obtained it, the Gores wrote that this was a mutual and mutually supportive decision that we have made together following a process of long and careful consideration. Al and Tipper Gore were separating after 40 years. There was no affair. 2 longtime family friends told the Associated Press, speaking anonymously because it was a personal matter, that there had been no third party, that the couple had simply grown apart. One of them gave the AP a single sentence that explains more about this marriage than the entire 2000 convention did. Their lives, the friend said, had gotten more and more separated. This is the documented account of what was actually happening inside a marriage the country used as a moral yardstick. It involves a Senate hearing that turned a second lady into a national punchline, a car accident outside a baseball stadium that nearly killed a 6-year-old boy, a clinical depression that a woman in the most scrutinized position in American public life chose to talk about out loud at a time when almost nobody in her position did, and a husband who was, for most of the years in question, somewhere else. The story America was sold was a love story. The documented story is more complicated, sadder, and in one specific way, considerably braver. 4 things to hold on to before we go back to the beginning, because each one runs directly into that email in 2010. She was a working newspaper photographer before she was ever a political wife, and she never put the camera down. The Senate hearing that made her a national joke was set in motion by an 11-year-old girl playing a record in her own living room. The woman the entire rock industry attacked as the enemy of music ended up playing drums on Frank Zappa's daughter's album. And the disclosure that could have ended her husband's presidential campaign was one she made on purpose, knowing exactly what had happened to the last national politician associated with clinical depression. Keep those in mind. Every one of them is documented, and together they describe a person almost nothing like the caricature the country settled on. She was not born Tipper Gore. She was born Mary Elizabeth Aitchison on August 19, 1948 in Washington, D.C. The nickname came from her mother, from a lullaby, and it stuck so completely that most Americans never learned her legal name. Her childhood was not the stable political family upbringing her later public image implied. Her parents separated when she was young, and she was raised primarily by her mother and her grandmother in Arlington, Virginia. By her own later account, given in the context of her mental health advocacy, depression ran in her family, and she has spoken about her mother's own struggles with it. This detail matters more than any other single fact about her early life. And we will come back to it, because decades later she would describe her own clinical depression in explicitly biological terms, as an illness rather than a failure of will. She had personal reasons to understand it that way. She had watched it in her own house, as a child, in an era when there was no vocabulary for it at all, and no treatment worth the name. A woman raised around depression that could not be named grew up to be the woman who stood in the White House and named it. That is the kind of connection that biography can only offer, not prove. But it is difficult to look at the arc of her advocacy and not see the child in Arlington somewhere behind it. In 1965, she was a student at St. Agnes School in Alexandria. That spring, she attended the senior prom at St. Albans School for Boys in Washington. There she met a 17-year-old senior named Albert Arnold Gore, Jr., the son of a sitting United States Senator from Tennessee. They were together, in one form or another, for the next 45 years. The letters from that period survive and were quoted in the Associated Press coverage of their separation. In one, written to Tipper when he was a 17-year-old freshman at Harvard, Al Gore complained that his mother was having a fit about him riding his motorcycle back to school and that his father was angry about his long hair. It is an ordinary teenage letter from a boy who would become vice president of the United States, and it is a reminder that this relationship predated every single thing either of them became. They married on May 19, 1970, at Washington National Cathedral. He was 22, she was 21. What happened next is a detail that most accounts skip, and it changes how you read everything that followed. Al Gore, back from Vietnam, took a job as a reporter at the Tennessean in Nashville, and Tipper Gore worked at the same newspaper as a photographer. She was not, at the start of this marriage, a political spouse. She was a working photojournalist with her own byline, her own equipment, her own eye. According to the NBC News account of their separation, her interest in photography continued long after she left journalism, and she usually had a camera with her. Consider the symmetry of that newsroom for a moment, because it is the last period in their lives when the two of them were doing the same kind of work at the same level. He was a reporter, she was a photographer. They covered the same city for the same paper. Neither one was the other's spouse in any professional sense. They were colleagues who happened to be married. Whatever the marriage became over the next 4 decades, it began between two people with parallel careers and roughly equal standing. That symmetry lasted about 6 years. In 1976, Al Gore ran for Congress, and from that point forward, the arrangement was permanently asymmetrical. One of them had a career with a public title attached. The other had a role. Hold on to the camera. It comes back at the end of this story in a way that is genuinely poignant. Al Gore was elected to the House of Representatives in 1976, taking the seat his father had once held. He moved to the Senate in 1984, 16 years in Congress. And during those 16 years, the pattern that would eventually define this marriage was already establishing itself, though nobody was reading it that way at the time. He was ambitious, driven, and increasingly absent. She was raising 4 children, Karenna, Kristen, Sarah, and Albert III, in Washington and Tennessee. And then, in 1985, Tipper Gore did something that made her one of the most argued about women in America. The origin of it was completely domestic. According to the account she gave repeatedly afterward, she bought her 11-year-old daughter Karenna the Prince album Purple Rain. She was in the room when the song Darling Nikki played. She listened to the lyrics, which were sexually explicit in a way she had not expected from an album marketed to children, and she was, by her own description, appalled. That is the entire origin story of one of the most consequential culture war fights of the 1980s. A mother listened to a record with her daughter. In 1985, Tipper Gore co-founded the Parents Music Resource Center with Susan Baker, the wife of Treasury Secretary James Baker, along with several other Washington wives. The organization's stated goal was narrow. They wanted a warning label on albums with violent or sexually explicit content so parents would know what they were buying for their children. The PMRC compiled a list of songs it considered most objectionable, which the press dubbed the Filthy 15. And on September 19, 1985, the Senate Commerce Committee held a hearing on the subject. Understand what that hearing actually was, because it is the moment Tipper Gore's public image was permanently set. The committee's members included Al Gore, her own husband. The optics were immediately terrible and entirely fair to point out. The wives of powerful Washington men had raised a concern, and the United States Senate had convened a hearing about it, and the musicians came to Washington to fight back. The recording industry sent 3 witnesses, and the selection was a masterstroke. If the industry had sent only long-haired metal musicians, the hearing would have played exactly as the PMRC wanted it to play. Instead, they sent a spread designed to make the committee look ridiculous from 3 different directions at once. Frank Zappa testified, so did John Denver. So did Dee Snider of Twisted Sister, who arrived in a sleeveless shirt and long hair and delivered testimony that was considerably more articulate than the senators appeared to expect. Zappa's testimony was blistering. He characterized the proposal as an ill-conceived piece of nonsense and argued that warning labels were a danger to freedom of expression, and he pressed the point that the whole exercise amounted to a small group of well-connected Washington wives attempting to legislate their own taste. John Denver was the one nobody saw coming. Here was the wholesome singer of country roads and Rocky Mountain highs, the least threatening figure in American popular music, and he sat in front of the Senate Commerce Committee and told them that censorship had a way of expanding well beyond its original intent. Denver noted that his own song, Rocky Mountain High, had been widely misread as a drug reference and banned from some radio stations by people who had decided they knew what it meant. His point was devastating precisely because it came from him. If a committee of adults could not correctly interpret John Denver, what business did anyone have deciding which records were dangerous? Dee Snider, meanwhile, did something the senators plainly did not anticipate. He showed up looking exactly like the caricature they expected, and then spoke in complete, structured, unfailingly polite paragraphs about the First Amendment, about being a married father and a practicing Christian, and about how his song Underblade, which the PMRC had flagged as being about sadomasochism and bondage, was actually about the experience of undergoing surgery. The gap between how he looked and what he said was the entire argument, made without him having to state it. The hearing was a cultural event and, for Tipper Gore personally, a disaster. She became, in the public imagination, the censor, the scold, the woman who wanted to put warning stickers on rock and roll. Musicians attacked her by name in songs for years afterward. The image stuck to her for the rest of her public life, and it followed her husband into 2 presidential campaigns. She always rejected the censorship framing. Her position, stated consistently, was that she was asking for information for parents, not for prohibition, and that as a private citizen, she had the same right to advocate as anyone else. Whether you find that persuasive depends largely on where you sat in the 1980s culture war, and this account is not going to pretend to settle it. But there is a documented coda that almost nobody knows, and it is the single most surprising fact in this entire story. Tipper Gore became friends with Frank Zappa's family. According to the Associated Press account, she later became friends with Gail Zappa, Frank's widow. And in 1999, she played drums and sang backup vocals on an album by Diva Zappa, Frank's daughter. Read that again. The woman Frank Zappa denounced in the United States Senate ended up playing drums on his daughter's record. That detail is worth sitting with because it tells you something about Tipper Gore that the caricature never allowed. She was an actual drummer, a musician since her teens, who owned a drum kit and played it. She had been in a band in high school. The woman the rock world cast as the enemy of music was, in her private life, a person who loved music enough to keep playing it while the entire industry mocked her by name. It also tells you something about how she handled being attacked, which is that she did not appear to hold grudges. The Zappas had every reason to despise her permanently, and Frank Zappa's contempt in 1985 was not performative. He meant it, and yet within a decade and a half, the families were friendly enough that his widow and his daughter welcomed her into a recording session. Somebody made the first move there. The record does not say who, but it says a great deal about both households that the move was made at all. The parental advisory label exists to this day. She won the fight and lost the argument. In 1988, Al Gore ran for president for the first time. He was 39. He drew little support outside the South, and the campaign ended early. He intended to run again in 1992. And then, in April of 1989, something happened that stopped everything. The Gore family had gone to a Baltimore Orioles game. As they were leaving the stadium, their 6-year-old son, Albert III, broke away from his parents and ran into the street. He was struck by a car. The injuries were catastrophic. The boy was thrown roughly 30 feet. He was gravely injured, and his survival was genuinely uncertain. He spent a month in the hospital and endured a long, difficult recovery. Everything else in this story flows out of that moment on the pavement outside a baseball stadium. It is worth pausing on what that experience actually is, because the phrase "a child was in an accident" does almost nothing to convey it. Both parents were there. They saw it happen. They were standing on a sidewalk after an ordinary family outing to a ball game, and then their youngest child was lying in the road. And for the next several hours, and then the next several weeks, they did not know whether he would live, and then did not know what condition he would live in. Al Gore has spoken about this period repeatedly in the decades since, and it functions in his own telling as the hinge of his life. He has described sitting in the hospital and reassessing everything he was doing and why. The environmental work that consumed the rest of his career traces directly back to that hospital room, by his own account. What is less discussed is that both parents were in that hospital room, and only one of them had a public reckoning that the country found admirable. Al Gore's response is documented and, by every account, sincere. He did not run for president in 1992. He stayed home. He wrote a book instead, Earth in the Balance, which became the foundation of the environmental work that would define the rest of his public life and eventually win him a Nobel Peace Prize and an Academy Award. Tipper Gore later wrote, in a passage quoted by the Associated Press, that it was a very spiritual time for both of us, and that in Al's case, he decided to write a book and not to run for president in 1992. Tipper Gore's response was different, and she did not talk about it publicly for a decade. In the aftermath of her son's accident, Tipper Gore developed clinical depression. It was serious enough to require professional treatment and medication. This is the center of her story, and it needs to be handled precisely because it is also the part of her life she chose to make useful to other people. What she experienced was a depressive episode triggered by severe trauma, the kind that mental health professionals see constantly in parents who have watched a child nearly die. It required treatment. She got treatment. She recovered. And then, years later, when she was Second Lady of the United States, she decided to say so out loud. Consider what that decision cost and what it required. In the 1990s, a public admission of psychiatric treatment by a national political figure or a member of their family was close to unthinkable. The conventional wisdom was that it was disqualifying. Political history offered a specific and terrifying precedent. In 1972, Senator Thomas Eagleton had been forced off the Democratic ticket within 18 days of being named the vice presidential nominee after it emerged that he had been hospitalized for depression. Every political professional in Washington knew that story. Tipper Gore was the wife of a sitting vice president who was widely expected to run for president, and she told the country she had been treated for clinical depression. She did it deliberately, and she framed it in specific language. Her position, stated consistently in her advocacy, was that depression is a biological brain disorder, an illness that can affect anyone regardless of their circumstances or status, and that it is treatable. She was arguing against the idea that it was a character flaw or a private shame. Every word of that framing was doing work. Biological, because the alternative framing was moral. Can affect anyone, because the assumption in 1999 was that it happened to weak people or unstable people or people whose lives had gone wrong. And here was a woman who had a Secret Service detail and a residence at the Naval Observatory. Treatable, because the third assumption was that it was permanent, that a person who had been depressed was permanently compromised, which was precisely the logic that had ended Thomas Eagleton's national career in 18 days. And there was a second, quieter argument embedded in her disclosure, aimed at a specific audience. She was describing a depression that followed a trauma. She was telling every parent in America who had watched a child get hurt, every person who had come through something terrible and then found themselves unable to function months later, that this was a known and recognized thing that happened to ordinary people and that there was treatment for it. The people who benefited from that disclosure are, by definition, uncountable. They are the people who went to a doctor because a woman on television said she had. The Clinton administration made her the mental health policy advisor to the president. She organized the first White House conference on mental health, held in June 1999. She used the platform of the Second Lady's office, an office with no formal power whatsoever, to push the question of mental health parity, the principle that insurance should cover psychiatric illness the way it covers physical illness. Parity is a dry, technical word for something that had enormous consequences in people's lives. Through most of the 20th century, American health insurance treated mental illness as a lesser category. Coverage was capped far lower than for physical conditions. A person could have insurance that would pay for open-heart surgery and effectively refuse to pay for a course of psychiatric treatment. The practical effect was that people who were ill either paid out of pocket, went without, or ended up in emergency rooms and jails. Changing that required an enormous, slow, unglamorous fight across multiple administrations, and Tipper Gore was one of the people pushing it during the period when the argument was being won. She was doing it with the credibility of someone who had been a patient. She was not lobbying on behalf of an abstraction. Her portfolio in those years extended further than mental health. She chaired the National Youth Fitness Campaign of the President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sports. She worked on homelessness, on children's welfare, on women's issues, and she was an early and public supporter of LGBT rights at a time when the administration she was part of was signing the Defense of Marriage Act. This is, by a considerable distance, the most consequential body of work Tipper Gore ever produced, and it is the thing she is least remembered for. There is a pattern here worth naming because it recurs in the lives of a lot of political wives. The country remembered her for the fight that made her a punchline, the record labels, and largely forgot the work that actually helped people. The PMRC hearing lasted one day in 1985. The mental health advocacy lasted decades. Guess which one made the obituaries and the comedy sketches? In 1992, Bill Clinton chose Al Gore as his running mate, and they won. The Gores moved into the vice president's residence at the Naval Observatory. Tipper Gore was Second Lady of the United States from 1993 to 2001. Those 8 years are where the public marriage and the private marriage diverged most sharply, and where the seeds of 2010 are most clearly visible in hindsight. Publicly, the Gores were the stable ones. This was not an accident of perception. It was, increasingly, a political function. The Clinton presidency was consumed from 1998 onward by the Monica Lewinsky scandal and the impeachment that followed, and the Gores' visible devotion served, in the Associated Press's own framing of their later separation, as a counterpoint to President Bill Clinton's philandering. That is a remarkable sentence when you sit with it. A marriage became useful as a contrast to another marriage. Their intimacy had a political job. And it is worth being precise about how that job worked, because it was not something the Gores announced, or, as far as any record shows, cynically engineered. It was assigned to them by circumstance. From 1998 onward, every reporter covering the administration was looking for a way to describe the Clinton marriage without saying the quiet part, and the easiest available shorthand was to gesture at the Gores. Look at the vice president and his wife. That is what a functional marriage looks like. The comparison did not require the Gores' participation. It only required them to keep standing next to each other in public, which they were doing anyway. But a marriage that has been drafted into public service is a marriage under a particular kind of pressure. Every appearance carries a second meaning. Every photograph is evidence in an argument neither of them started. And when a couple has been performing stability for the cameras for years as a political necessity, it becomes progressively harder for anyone outside, and possibly for the people inside, to distinguish the performance from the thing itself. By 2000, when Al Gore ran for president in his own right, that contrast was central to his positioning. He needed to be the moral restoration after 8 years of scandal, and the most powerful available evidence was his wife. Hence, the kiss. On August 17, 2000, at the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles, Tipper introduced her husband, and he crossed the stage and kissed her at length in front of the country. It was covered as a political act because it was one. It was read correctly as a statement about the difference between this Democrat and the last one. Al Gore lost the 2000 election to George W. Bush after the closest and most contested presidential result in modern American history, decided ultimately by the Supreme Court after a 5-week recount fight in Florida. He won the national popular vote and lost the presidency. It is worth registering what that does to a family because it is genuinely unusual. Losing an election is common in politics. Losing an election you may well have won, and then conceding for the good of the country, and then living the rest of your life in a nation where roughly half the population believes you were robbed, and the other half believes you are a sore loser, is a specific and unusual kind of aftermath. Whatever else was happening privately between the Gores in the years that followed, they were living inside that. And then the couple that had spent 30 years inside American politics were, suddenly, private citizens. What happened over the following decade is not dramatic, and that is precisely why it is worth understanding. There was no scandal, there was no betrayal, there was no third party. What there was, according to the people closest to them, was drift. Drift is the least cinematic thing that can happen to a marriage, and by a wide margin the most common. It does not produce a moment. There is no discovery, no confrontation, no letter found in a suitcase. There is only the slow accumulation of separate calendars, separate cities, separate work, until two people who have known each other since a high school prom look up and find that the overlap has quietly gone to almost nothing. Al Gore's post-political career was enormous and enormously demanding. He campaigned worldwide on climate change. The documentary An Inconvenient Truth won an Academy Award in 2007. He shared the Nobel Peace Prize the same year. He was, in the words of the associates who spoke to the Associated Press, on the road frequently. He had found, at nearly 60, the defining work of his life, and it required him to be almost anywhere other than home. Tipper Gore was not on that road with him. She returned to photography, the thing she had been doing when they met, the camera she had carried through 4 decades. She continued her mental health work. She built a life in Nashville and California that was, increasingly, her own. And here's the thing that neither of them appears to have done anything wrong about. She was 62 years old and had spent 40 years arranging her life around someone else's schedule, and she stopped. There is a version of this story where that is a tragedy. There is another version where a woman who had been a photographer at 21 got to be a photographer again at 62. The record does not tell us which version the people involved would choose, and it is not this account's place to choose for them. And on June 1, 2010, they told their friends by email that it was over. The language of the announcement is worth quoting precisely because it was clearly written with great care and it has been widely misread. According to the Associated Press, which obtained the email, the Gores described it as a mutual and mutually supportive decision that we have made together following a process of long and careful consideration. Gore spokeswoman Kaylee Kreider confirmed to reporters that the statement had come from the Gores and declined to comment further. The press immediately went looking for a scandal, because that is what the press does, and there wasn't one. 2 longtime close associates and family friends told the Associated Press, on condition of anonymity, that the couple had grown apart after 40 years of marriage and that there was no affair involved. The associates said that over time, the Gores had carved out separate lives, with the former vice president on the road frequently, and then the sentence that is the real ending of this story. One of the associates told the AP their lives had gotten more and more separated, not a betrayal, an erosion. They separated. By the accounts published in the years since, they did not descend into acrimony. They remained on good terms and continued to spend holidays and family occasions together with their 4 children and their grandchildren. Now let me be clear about what the documented record supports and where it stops, because both Al and Tipper Gore are living private citizens, and precision matters more here than anywhere else in this account. The firm ground is substantial. The marriage date, the 4 children, the PMRC, and the 1985 Senate hearing, the testimony of Zappa, Denver, and Snyder, the parental advisory label, the 1989 accident, Tipper Gore's publicly acknowledged treatment for clinical depression, her role as the president's mental health policy advisor, the 1999 White House Conference on Mental Health, the 2000 convention, the 2000 election, and the June 2010 separation announcement are all matters of public record, documented in contemporaneous reporting by the Associated Press, NBC News, and others, and in Tipper Gore's own public statements in writing. The soft ground is the interior of the marriage. The characterization that they grew apart, that separate lives had formed, that there was no affair, comes from 2 anonymous friends speaking to the Associated Press in June 2010. That is credible sourcing, but it is anonymous sourcing, and it reflects what people close to the couple wish to convey at a difficult moment. The Gores themselves have never publicly detailed why the marriage ended, and they are entitled not to. And what is genuinely unknowable is the private emotional truth of a 40-year relationship. No account, including this one, can tell you what those 2 people felt about each other in the years between the kiss in 2000 and the email in 2010. Anyone who claims otherwise is inventing. There is one more thing that honesty requires, and it is about the framing this story usually receives. It is tempting and common to treat the Gore separation as a story about hypocrisy. The couple who sold America a perfect marriage exposed. That framing is cheap, and it is not supported by anything in the record. There is no evidence the Gores were faking anything in 2000. What the record actually shows is something far more ordinary and far more human. 2 people who married at 21 and 22, built a life through 4 children and a near catastrophe, and 16 years in Congress and 8 in the White House, and then, in their 60s, found that the people they had become no longer fit together. That is not hypocrisy. It is the most common story in the world, happening to 2 of the most watched people in America. So return, finally, to the camera. The woman who walked into that convention hall in 2000 to be kissed in front of the country had started out as a working photojournalist at a Nashville newspaper, standing behind a lens, framing other people's pictures. Then she spent 40 years in front of the lens instead, in a role where her job was to be photographed, to stand beside, to introduce, to embody a marriage that had become a political argument. And when it ended, she went back to the camera. According to the NBC News account, her photography never stopped. She usually had a camera with her, right through all of it. That is the through line the caricature missed entirely. Not the scold from the Senate hearing, not the prop from the convention stage. A photographer, a drummer, a woman who told an entire country that she had been treated for depression at a moment when doing so could have destroyed her husband's career, and did it anyway because she thought it would help people who had no platform of their own. The marriage America was sold in 2000 was real for a long time, and then it wasn't, and nobody did anything wrong. What survived it was the work. The parental advisory label is still on the records. The mental health conversation she forced into the open in 1999 is now something politicians can have without ending their careers. Tipper Gore's marriage was never the one America was sold. It was quieter, harder, and considerably more ordinary than the myth. And the woman inside it turned out to be far more interesting than either.